Howdy here from the porch. We've got another issue that's affecting the black citizens of the United States. It's called the purge. The purged community. And people of color, Democrats, I don't know who all are being purged, but there's a lot of them. And this article from Mother Jones this month called Purged tells us more. In February, Michelle Mackey, a 53-year-old Milwaukee resident, went to cast her vote in a local primary for mayor and county executive. Mackey described herself as an avid voter who participates regularly in state and national elections and took part in voter registration drives in 2016. But when she arrived at her polling place at Washington High School in the city's Sherman Park neighborhood, which is predominantly black, she said she was told there was no record of her registration. I was mad as hell, she recalled. She feared she had been purged from the voter rolls, and with good reason. Just before Christmas, she saw on the news that Wisconsin had identified 232,000 voters it claimed had moved and had been ordered to remove them from its registration list within 30 days if they did not respond to a mailing. It's not exactly clear why Mackey was told she was not registered to vote. Just in case, she'd come with her ID and electric bills. She was able to cast a ballot that day, and records show she was still in the poll book. But the whole experience left her upset. The state's efforts to remove voters, Mackey said, was a slap in the face to minorities and people of color. And it may be one reason why a lot of people came out to vote in April, even though they had COVID-19 scare all over the state. In Milwaukee, which is home to nearly 2/3 of the state's black population, 1 in 8 registered voters was at risk of being purged. African American turnout in the cities had already plummeted in 2016 after Republicans passed a voter ID law that, according to Republican Senator aide in sworn testimony, was found to state that it was to silence Democrats and left-leaning voters in Milwaukee. 55% of the registered notices were sent to municipalities where Hillary Clinton had defeated Donald Trump, according to Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and 9 of the 10 areas with the highest concentration of voters on the purge list were big cities and college towns that had voted for Clinton. Milwaukee and Madison, the state's 2 Democratic strongholds, accounted for 14% of the state's registered voters, but 23% of the names on the removal list. We'll call that a purge list. The state's bipartisan election commission had originally planned to give voters until 2021, but then to confirm their addresses and registration status before removing them from the rolls. But in November 2019, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, a conservative group, sued the commission to force it to immediately purge voters who had not responded to the mailing. A month later, a Republican-appointed judge, Paul Malloy, sided with the group and approved the fast-tracked purge. That meant 7% of the state's electorate could be removed from the voters' rolls ahead of what's expected to be the close presidential race in the state. Trump won only by 22,000 votes in 2016. I'm reading this because these are targeted towards minority groups and Democrats, but I wasn't registered as a Democrat when I felt the purge in Kansas City, Kansas, back in the 1980s. I'd simply missed 1 or 2 elections, and I asked to vote in the presidential, and we're talking about small elections, and they refused to send me a ballot. That meant 7% of the state's electorate could be removed from the voters ahead of Trump's election. Remember that. Wisconsin is not the only state taking aggressive action to trim voter rolls. Days after Malloy's ruling, Georgia's Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger purged more than 300,000 voters, 4% of the electorate whose registrations were deemed inactive or out of date, including 120,000 who were removed because they hadn't voted in several previous elections and hadn't responded to a mailing. More than 20,000 people who had been wrongly labeled inactive were added back onto the rolls following a court filing from Fair Fight Action, a voting rights group founded by 2018 Democratic gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, and I hope she runs again. Like Wisconsin, Georgia has seen rampant voter suppression and razor-thin elections. Abrams failed to qualify for a runoff against Republican Brian Kemp in the 2018 governor's race by fewer than 18,000 votes. After Kemp, who as Secretary of State oversaw his own gubernatorial election, instituted a number of practices that made it even harder to vote. That included putting 53,000 voter registrations on hold before the election, 80% of them from voters of color, and advising counties on how to close polling places. More than 200 precincts closed, primarily in areas with large black populations. So let's get this straight. The purges in Wisconsin and Georgia and other states like Ohio, which released a purge list of tens of thousands of heirs last year, are part of a decade-long push by Republican officials and conservative legal groups that has removed Democratic constituencies and people of color from registration lists. From 2016 to 2018, 17 million Americans, 8% of the nation's electorate, were taken off the voting rolls, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. Many of these removals took place in states with long histories of voting discrimination, especially in states like Georgia, where diversifying demographics have us on the precipice of a transformative political change. We are seeing Republicans employ voter suppression to limit who has access to the polls, says Abrams. Disproportionately under GOP secretaries of state, this process affects Democrats, particularly in communities of color, she adds. The clear intention is to strip people of their right to vote. It's long been said that the elections are decided by turnout, but in 2020, we have to ask a different question. Will tens of thousands or even millions of voters in critical battleground states find out they're suddenly not eligible to cast a vote? What do you think? At the country's founding, there were no voter registrations in the United States. People simply showed up at the polls offering credentials such as proof of property or residency as needed. Early registration laws passed in the mid-1800s, when the vote was still mostly limited to white men, were largely designed to prevent rather than encourage political participation. Historian Alexander Kieser writes in The Right to Vote, in 1840, the Whig Party in New York passed a voter registration law that applied only to New York City, clearly aimed at Irish Catholic immigrants who voted Democratic. Voter registration laws became a widespread tool of voter suppression in the tumultuous era after Reconstruction, as southern states sought to disenfranchise African Americans and northern states sought to disenfranchise immigrants. During the Jim Crow era, literacy tests and poll taxes made it all but impossible for a majority of black Americans to register and vote, and frequent voter purges kept many who did register from holding onto the right. Following the Brown Board of Education, that's right over here in Kansas, decision in 1954, the Louisiana legislature formed a segregation committee which advocated widespread voter purges as a way to keep black Americans from organizing politically. This is what the Republican administrations have been enforcing in recent years. State Senator Willis Reinhardt authored a pamphlet called Vote Qualification Laws in Louisiana, the key to victory in the segregation struggle, he said. In 1959, the White Citizens Council of Washington Parish, north of New Orleans, convinced local registers to remove 85% of black registered voters for alleged defects in their registration cards, but just 0.07% of white voters. A federal court reversed the purge, calling it a massively discriminatory action or scheme to remove all of the Negro voters from the rolls and leave the white voters practically untouched. Finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed many of these suppressive laws and tactics, and the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, known as the Motor Voter Law, made voter registration far more accessible by allowing people to register at DMV and other public agencies. Yet, purges persisted as Republicans sought new ways to circumvent protection for voters of color, a growing part of the electorate that favored Democratic candidates. During a 1981 gubernatorial election in New Jersey, the Republican National Committee used outdated registration lists to send sample ballots to largely non-white neighborhoods. When 45,000 mailers were returned as undeliverable, the RNC created a list of voters to challenge at the polls, stationing armed off-duty cops wearing National Ballot Security Task Force at the voting booths in heavily black and Latino polling sites in Newark and Trenton. The Democratic candidate, Jim Florio, lost the race to Republican Tom Keene by 1,797 votes. The RNC chair credited this tactic for Keene's victory. The Democratic National Committee won a legal settlement restricting RNC's future ballot security operations, which functioned as unofficial voter purges. 5 years later, during the U.S. Senate race in Louisiana, the RNC sent similar mailers to majority black precincts and used the returned mail to generate a list of 31,000 mostly black voters to challenge at the polls. A committee official said the efforts would keep the black vote down considerably. The settlement expired in 2017, potentially opened the doors to new voter challenges by Republicans in 2020 there. In 2000, a purge changed the outcome of a presidential election and the course of American history. Under Republican Governor Jeb Bush and Secretary of State Katherine Harris, Florida sent electoral supervisors a list of 58,000 people the state believed had felony records. At the time, Florida was one of a handful of states that permanently prevented people with past felony convictions from voting. But Florida did not stop at purging these supposed felons. People were added to the purge list if 70% of the letters and their names matched an entry in the state's felony database. The list was both discriminatory. African Americans made up 11% of registered voters in the state, but 44% of those purged. After the election and following the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision stopping the state's recount, an official audit found that as many as 12,000 registered voters had been mislabeled as having felony records, a number 22 times greater than George W. Bush's 537 vote margin of victory in Florida. Instead of backing away from voter purging, the Justice Department under Bush accelerated its use, suing 4 times for violating a provision of the 1993 Motor Voter Law that required states to make a reasonable effort to remove voters who had died or moved from the official list. The clause had been inserted into the bill to win GOP support back then. The Bush administration interpreted the provision far more aggressively than the Clinton administration had, turning the law that was supposed to help people register to vote into a weapon to remove voters from the rolls. Missouri, where I live, was one of the states the administration sued. Like Florida, Missouri was the site of a disastrous purge in 2000. In the run-up to the election, the St. Louis Election Commission sent postcards to all the registered voters in the city and reclassified 50,000 voters as inactive after their mail was returned as undeliverable without notifying them of the change. That led to chaos on election day when thousands of voters found they were on the inactive list. Under a legal settlement with the Justice Department, St. Louis agreed to refrain from removing voters from rolls until after the 2004 election and to notify any voter move to inactive status. But in 2005, over the objections of the Republican appointed U.S. attorney from western Missouri, the Justice Department sued the state to force it to conduct a purge before the 2006 midterm election. A federal court ruled against the Justice Department, but the Bush administration had already laid the groundwork for using the motor voter law to conduct sweeping voter purges. This is what we're facing and we're in the middle of right now. Abuse, misuse of power. Americans must not only demand the end of abuse of power by police, but also of elections commissions, attorneys general, states attorneys general, others who are interfering with the power, our right to vote. After Barack Obama took office, former Bush administration lawyers joined a constellation of conservative legal groups with innocuous sounding names such as Judicial Watch, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, and American Constitutional Rights Union. These groups have sent threatening letters and filed dozens of lawsuits to try to force states and counties with substantial populations of color to purge their voting rolls. These groups are bullying and pressuring election administrators into purging, says Myrna Perez, director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights Program. In January, Judicial Watch sent letters to 19 large counties in California, Colorado, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, all of which voted for Clinton in 2016, warning them that they would be sued unless they trimmed their voting rolls within 90 days. Pittsburgh's Allegheny County, where Clinton won by 17 points, immediately began removing 69,000 inactive voters. Last year, Judicial Watch reached a settlement with California to reassess 1.5 million names on the voter rolls in Los Angeles County. To justify such purges, Judicial Watch has claimed there are more registered voters than adult citizens in some of these places, opening the door to widespread voter fraud. I think this is all fraud, purging voters, especially those who have the legal right to vote. It repeated this charge right before the 2020 Iowa caucus, alleging that 8 Iowa counties have more voter registration than citizens old enough to register. In fact, only one of these 8 counties had more registered voters than adult citizens, and voting rights experts say there's little risk of fraud and evidence that people are exploiting out-of-date registration. The number of fraud cases in America over the last decade probably can be counted on my 2 hands. So I don't know what they're talking about, except it's a fraud what they're doing to take people off the polls. We should be like the rest of Europe. If we're going to have IDs for everybody across the nation that are federally government monitored, why don't we just say everybody's registered to vote? Okay? Everybody. Automatically. Quit purging people. They claim that people impersonate voters who have moved or died. Even Iowa's Republican Secretary of State called Judicial Watch's assertions fake news, echoing Judicial Watch's unsubstantiated claims of bloated voter rolls. Another conservative group, the Honest Elections Project, recently threatened to sue Colorado, Michigan, and Florida. The rationale of removing voters from the rolls to protect against fraud is nonsensical, Abrams said. This is a pretext for blocking voices that they don't want to hear. The Trump administration has encouraged such tactics. In June 2017, the Justice Department sent a letter to 44 states informing them that it was reviewing their voter list maintenance procedures and asking how they plan to remove the names of ineligible voters. Vanita Gupta, who headed the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division under President Obama, and is now president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, called a mass mailing of this sort virtually unprecedented. The Supreme Court's conservative majority has abetted these purges. Yeah, we have got to replace some of these Supreme Court justices or expand the court to make sure that they don't get out of line anymore after 2020. In 2013, the court ruled in Shelby County versus Holder that states with a long history of